Washington mulls military action in Iraq as Islamic State militants expand across the country, forcing thousands to flee. A wave of terrorist bombings across Iraq leaves over 40 people dead and scores of others injured. And Hamas says that no agreement to extend the Gaza ceasefire will be reached unless its demands are met. Hello there, you're watching AEE TV World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Amid growing international concern over the recent advances by Islamic State militants in Iraq, the White House refused to rule out the possibility of airstrikes against IS positions. The airstrikes would apparently be aimed at helping the thousands of people from Iraq's minority groups who have been trapped or displaced by the militant onslaught. The news comes following reports that the US President Barack Obama was considering airstrikes or humanitarian airdrops in the conflict-torn country. Following a telephone conversation with the head of Iraq's Kurdistan regional government, Masoud Barzani, the French President François Hollande also pledged his country's support to forces battling militants in Iraq.
What I can do is I can give you some insight into the President's thinking in general about the kinds of principles that would apply to contemplated military action. That would include no combat boots being put on the ground in Iraq. The President's been clear about that, and that principle continues to hold. The President's also been clear that any sort of military action that would be taken in Iraq would be very limited in scope and very specific to addressing a core American objective. The President has, at the same time, demonstrated his clear willingness to take the kind of military action that's required to protect core American interests. Those interests include things like protecting American personnel around the globe. He's taken actions like that in other countries. The President has also made clear that American military action in Iraq would not include combat boots on the ground. That is a principle that the President laid out at the beginning, and that continues to be true today.
The mayhem orchestrated by the extremists in Iraq has shifted northward into the once safe Kurdish territories. After hours of fighting, the Peshmerga Kurdish forces lost the battle for the strategic Mosul Dam near Sinjar. The dam is a vital piece of infrastructure that has given the Islamic State militants control of water and electricity in the entire region. And this wasn't the only loss by the Peshmerga. The Kurds also withdrew from the towns of Hamdaniya, Bashika, Kosh, as well as the district of Makhmur, north of Mosul, after the IS flooded the region with militants. The surprising pullout by the Kurds came after the Al-Qaeda offshoot captured the predominantly Christian city of Karakosh. Its churches have been destroyed, and up to 1,500 ancient manuscripts were burned. The attacks forced tens of thousands to flee their homes. Minority sects such as Christian and Yazidis feared that death was the only outcome if they stayed in their towns. In the past couple of weeks, IS has sought new territory after its failure to capture Baghdad. And the Iraqi army is making more ground against IS on that front. The Udaym district north of the capital was recaptured after heavy clashes.
The whole area of Udaym, nearby districts are all secure and safe and are under control. We have defeated the Islamic State.
But the advances made by the army don't seem to be quick enough, with IS making considerable gains in the north. Now many displaced are concerned if the advances made by the IS are not halted soon, and there will be no safe haven for minority groups in Iraq.
Let's get our Iraq correspondent on the phone. Mustafa, tell us more about the fighting taking place in northern Iraq.
Yes, actually, Kurdish forces keep losing territories to IS militants in north of Iraq, and especially they have lost the city Karakosh, which is the largest city, contains thousands of Christians. And also today, the Peshmerga forces were reportedly retreating from different sites and different military bases, which it was under their control. The Peshmerga forces, actually, all the Kurdish officials, they said that Peshmerga forces are well prepared and ready to tackle and to repel any attack by IS militants or other militant groups. But till now, we did not see that happening. Actually, the Peshmerga forces now are retreating, and actually they are leaving their sites and their posts dramatically. At the same time, the Iraqi army is advancing, and now the Iraqi army actually regained the control on 2 villages in Tuzkhurmato, which is located in Salahuddin province. But IS militants now actually they are approaching from the main or the major provinces in Kurdistan, and they said today there is reports said that IS militants actually control Zakho city in the Hoc province, and they also seized another checkpoint which is located at the border of Erbil province. Yes.
And how are Americans coordinating with Iraqi forces on this? And is there any talk among Iraqi officials of future US airstrikes to help target the IS militants?
Well, the United States, they are supposed to be the biggest ally to the Iraqi government. Especially, there is a strategic deal between the two governments, the Iraqi and the Americans. But till now, the Iraqi officials and the Prime Minister and all the Iraqi officials, they actually officially asked the American assistance to tackle IS militants and actually to provide the support to the Iraqi security forces. Until now, the Americans did not show any commitment to the deal, and they did not support the Iraqi army in any way. They said that they sent some drones just to protect their personnel and their advisors in Iraq. So, according to security political experts, they said that the Americans are doing nothing, just denouncing the attacks of IS militants, which this cannot be reliable to the Iraqi government and the Iraqi government, and also the Kurdish officials and the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kurdistan. He asked the assistance of the Americans, but they did not do anything. And they said, and the officials in Baghdad now they believe that Americans cannot provide anything, cannot do anything tangible, cannot provide palpable assistance to the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi government should try to seek another allies like with some regional countries to help them in their fight against the infamous IS militants.
All right, Mustafa, thank you for those updates. Well, Iraq's Defense Ministry released a video of the Iraqi Air Force carrying out airstrikes against militant positions in the north of the country. The footage shows military helicopters targeting a number of buildings and vehicles belonging to the Islamic State in their stronghold cities of Mosul, Tikrit and Amerli, inflicting heavy losses. The Prime Minister's military spokesman said that an airstrike on an IS Sharia court in Mosul killed 60 militants. Other airstrikes left 96 terrorists dead in the Qaraya district south of Mosul, while 127 were killed when an airstrike targeted militant gatherings in several areas across Mosul. Meanwhile, over 30 people were killed in bomb attacks across the Iraqi capital Baghdad and the central city of Kirkuk. At least 20 people died when a suicide bomber detonated an explosive-laden car at a checkpoint in the Khadmiya district of the capital. Another 11 people were killed when the 2 car bombs exploded near a Shia mosque holding displaced people in the strategic northern oil town of Kirkuk. Dozens more were reportedly wounded in those attacks. Let's now speak to Sami Ramadani. He is an author and an academic. Mr. Ramadani, with no certainty over whether US airstrikes are an option on the table, would US involvement actually help solve the crisis in Iraq?
I really don't think so. I think it will make the situation 10 times worse, because there are enough evidence to suggest that the United States and NATO countries have been arming various groups within the context of the conflict in Syria. A lot of these groups were armed through a member Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others. And a lot of these armaments and funds eventually ended up with ISIS. So ISIS really is a product of US policy in the region, the product of the occupation of Afghanistan, of Iraq, of intervention in Libya, intervention in Syria. ISIS fighters come from all over the world, including Europe, many parts of the world where the United States has been funding these extremist groups, or arming them at least, while the Saudis and Qataris have been funding them. So to suggest that the United States could help the Iraqi people is really a big contradiction in terms. So the last thing the Iraqi people need is further US intervention. But it is at the same time, one has to realize that ISIS and the groups that are allied to ISIS in Iraq, groups like former Iraqi army officers under Saddam's regime, Ba'ath Party, some well-known other armed groups, have all become allies of ISIS. And one has to also suggest and say that for the past several weeks, it has become apparent that the Peshmerga under Barzani's leadership, the Kurdistan Democratic Party Peshmerga, have had a de facto, an implicit type ceasefire with ISIS. So if the Peshmerga of Barzani and Peshmerga of PUK, Patriotic Union of Kurdistan under Talabani, and the Iraqi government forces form some form of unity against ISIS, that will be a much better solution than inviting American intervention in Iraq.
Yes, but that ceasefire you are talking about seems to have broken when the Kurdish interests conflicted with the IS's. Even with this coordination, or this apparent coordination with the Iraqi and Peshmerga forces, why are IS militants still gaining more ground?
Well, because they have been very powerful and very well organized. They've been preparing for this for many years, remember, especially within the context of the Syrian conflict. They've been quite strong in Syria for the last 3 years. And they have been well prepared. And also, one has to realize that the Iraqi state is a very weak state, because the armed forces themselves were destroyed, and in their place we have an army which was set up by the United States. It's a very weak army. It's an infiltrated type institution. That's why 3 divisions of the Iraqi army disappeared overnight, literally, when ISIS advanced into Mosul. There is a sectarian type of institutions in Iraq, unfortunately. So we have lots of problems. But the immediate danger to the people now is really this ISIS advance that has to be stopped. And if Barzani is really serious, he's got more than 100,000 Peshmerga under his command. They are extremely well armed. A lot of the equipment of the 3 divisions that disappeared fell into the hands of the Peshmerga, by the way, not just of ISIS. So if they are serious, if Barzani is really serious, then he could do a lot. And we will wait and see whether he is serious about fighting this terrorist threat to the Iraqi people in general, and to the Kurdish people as well, because these people don't know what alliances mean or what ceasefires mean. They can easily turn against their allies, and they did the same in Syria. Syria. They did with some of the groups in Syria, then they turned against them. And are killing Kurdish people in northern Syria. They are killing minorities of all sorts in the Mosul plains, including some Kurds, some Shia Kurds, for example, Christians, Yazidi Kurds, Yazidi Arabs, and so on and so forth. So they know no allies. They are, and a lot of Iraqis today think, and maybe justifiably, that what ISIS is doing is directly serving US interests and Israeli interests. While ISIS was killing Iraqi people, the Israelis were massacring the Palestinians in Gaza. And it seems the United States is using ISIS, in effect, to pressure on any central government in Baghdad. They are using ISIS like the stick to put pressure on Baghdad, to put pressure even on Iran, on Syria. They are even using them in the context of the Lebanon. They started attacking even the Lebanese army and so on and so forth.
All right, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Sami Ramadani, an author and an academic joining us from London.
You're welcome.
Well, militants from the so-called Islamic State have also seized parts of a military base in Syria's Raqqa province after a two-day battle with Syrian troops, which left dozens dead. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that at least 27 Syrian soldiers were killed, as well as 14 IS militants, including 3 who launched the assault by blowing themselves up at the entrance of the base on Wednesday night. The latest attack marks the latest string in advances by terrorist groups across the north and eastern province. Human Rights Watch has deplored Jordan's compulsory deportation of Palestinian refugees escaping the violence in Syria since the beginning of the conflict in 2011 as a breach of international duty.
During our research in 2013 and 2014, Human Rights Watch documented around 16 or so forcible deportations of Palestinians back to Syria. And in our latest research for this report, we documented actually 8 cases of deportation.
A number of Palestinians who fled to Jordan were deported back to Syria by force. According to the information we have, more than 100 people were deported back to Syria from Jordan, and this represents a big breach to Jordan's international duties.
The armed wing of the Palestinian resistance group Hamas has warned of renewed fighting with the Israeli entity if talks in Cairo to extend a 72-hour truce in Gaza collapsed. In a televised address, Al-Qassam brigades announced that if the Israeli siege on the Gaza Strip is not lifted and the Palestinian demands weren't met by Friday, it would resume military operations against occupation forces, adding that its resistance fighters were ready to return to a prolonged battle that would take hundreds of Israeli prisoners and lives. This as the Israelis and the Palestinians are continuing with Egyptian brokered negotiations in Cairo.
The ghosts of the war are haunting the Gaza Strip and may even return on Friday morning. As the ceasefire deadline looms, Palestinians living in Gaza are praying that the Israelis will not unleash their war beasts again. Egyptian-mediated negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians are underway in Cairo, where efforts to prolong a truce are intensifying. Egyptian officials are shuttling between the Israeli and Palestinian delegations, which under the current state of war do not negotiate face-to-face. The Israelis have allegedly shown willingness to extend a 72-hour ceasefire to secure a long-lasting agreement that would see an end of hostilities, at least until the next Israeli offensive is launched against the besieged enclave. Hamas, however, has denied having reached such an agreement. Hamas deputy leader Musa Abu Marzouk tweeted there is no agreement to extend the ceasefire. An Egyptian official, meanwhile, said that the indirect talks between the Palestinians and Israelis are moving forward. It is still too early to talk about outcomes, but they are optimistic. Now, with so many demands on the table, the temporary ceasefire could be extended to allow more space for talks. If not, the possibility of the Israeli war machine rearing its ugly head again is very likely.
This is hundreds of Palestinians have rallied in the Gaza Strip in support of Hamas. The pro-Hamas march was held near territories occupied by the Israeli entity to reiterate popular backing for the Palestinian resistance. Demonstrators also voiced their support for the ongoing negotiations in Egypt and demanded that the Israelis lift the blockade imposed on Gaza.
Our fighters are still deployed in the field, awaiting the results of talks that are taking place in Cairo. Today, in our meeting in Egypt, all the options will be weighed, but the shortest way for the occupation to respond to the demands of the resistance, and for them to realize that they cannot have peace and security if they do not accept the Palestinian people as a reality in their lives, and our legitimate and just demands are the only path to achieve a full ceasefire.
Until this moment, there is no indication that there is agreement between Palestinian negotiators and the Zionist enemy through Egypt mediation. We say that all the options are open with this Zionist enemy, and surely the Palestinian people have a wise and mature political leadership that will make the right decision in every event and situation.
Political analyst Omar Ismail joins us now via Skype from London. Mr. Ismail, are the Israelis in a position to break down the talks and commence fighting in Gaza?
I think the Israelis now in a very awkward and very spiky position in terms of negotiations and also in terms of continuing the war. I don't think they have achieved all the goals that they have set out to achieve in destroying the tunnels and disarming Hamas. The talks in Cairo at the moment, I think they are in a deadlock between the demands of the Israelis of disarming Hamas and the demands of the Palestinian, the right and the legitimate demands of the Palestinian of having an airport, having a port, a seaport, and having access through Israel by opening all the crossings with Israel. I think the Hamas itself has not achieved either its stated goals at this stage, but it has, in a measured way, have managed to win the sympathies of a lot of people in the West and elsewhere in the world.
Mr. Ismail, some would say that these talks have been made to collapse because, let's face it, Egypt does have an interest to undermine Hamas.
Indeed, and there is an ideological differences between the regime in Egypt and the Hamas regime, because obviously the Muslim Brotherhood connection and the demise of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt has affected adversely Hamas standing within Gaza itself. It has somewhat diminished its ability to deal with Egypt since the changes have taken place. However, Egypt have always supported the Palestinian people. Hundreds of thousands of Egyptians have lost their life. A huge amount of Egyptian blood was sacrificed over Palestine by the Egyptians. And the Egyptians have always stood by the Palestinian people and their legitimate right of existence and their legitimate right of having two states side by side.
Is there a middle ground that could be achieved between warring sides at this moment, with Tel Aviv saying that it wants Hamas to disarm and Palestinians calling for nothing less than the lifting of the siege?
Well, and this is where the demands of both sides are somewhat are not matching the reality on the ground. I think Israel, in the end, is losing much more than it can gain. It's lost the sympathy of a lot of countries in the world, and a lot of people around the world are now sympathizing with the cause, or not of the Hamas, but with the Palestinian people. That is one thing. The other thing is that Israel itself has now internally once the war, and this is, I think, what probably creating a huge amount of confusion within the Israeli government, that it has lost a significant number of its civilian, as well as I wouldn't say a significant number of civilians, or 3 civilians, and a significant number of military personnel during the last 3.5 weeks of hostilities. And the government, the Israeli government, will need now to produce something tangible by stopping the rockets flying into Israel from Gaza. I don't think they will be able to achieve that, and that will undermine the standing of Netanyahu government, in my view. The Netanyahu government has now lost, while there is a huge amount of support to what is happening in Gaza, but I think once the hostility ceases, there will be obviously there will be a huge amount of pressure on Netanyahu to account for what happened in Gaza and why he didn't achieve, and his government did not achieve, what they originally set out to achieve, and that's disarming Hamas. It would be impossible to disarm Hamas. Hamas, whether you disagree with their ideology or you agree with it, Hamas is an ideology. It cannot be wiped out. And if Israel thinks that bombing people out of existence will secure its secure a peace, then they are hugely mistaken, and they are underestimated not only the Palestinian resolve but also the international opinion.
All right, political analyst Omar Ismail, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this.
You're quite welcome.
As a permanent ceasefire between the Israelis and Palestinian resistance factions is being debated in Egypt, Gazan residents who were forced to flee their homes are rooting for a truce that would end Israeli aggression.
As a countdown to the deadline of a ceasefire between the Israelis and the Palestinians in Gaza nears its end, Gazans victimized by Israeli aggression are hoping that the negotiations in Egypt will result in a permanent truce.
There is no other shelter for us except the schools. We don't know where to go. We went to check on the house and we did not find anything. Everything was destroyed under the rubble. There's nothing left.
We want a ceasefire and peace, and for the Arab world to look at us. Are we not humans like everyone else? Everyone is living except us. We're miserable and homeless. We've suffered from 4 wars in 3 years.
For many of those who took advantage of the 72-hour ceasefire that ends on Friday morning to return to where their homes used to stand and try to salvage what's left of their belongings in the rubble, a ceasefire means security.
We want a ceasefire, and for us to have peace and security and have a safe home for us and our children. Each of us has to care for 13 people. The smallest family in this area is composed of 13 people. We're now stranded and homeless. Where are we gonna go?
Me and my 5 children, our homes and possessions, everything is being destroyed. My son is a newlywed. He never got a chance to be happy.
Pursuing happiness in Gaza, however, is like chasing clouds when not even the basic living conditions are available for its residents due to the Israeli blockade. A recent report has shown that 70% of Gazans have no drinking water. This shortage not only applies to water, but also to electricity, medical supplies, and other basic necessities.
You're watching Al Ittijah World News, still to come. Iran and the P5+1 group resume nuclear talks in Vienna.
ISIS militants take full control of the province of Mosul.
Iraqi army advances in Mosul after fierce fighting with ISIS militants. Mosul will be liberated soon. Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Washington mulls military action in Iraq as Islamic State militants expand across the country, forcing thousands to flee. A wave of terrorist bombings across Iraq leave over 40 people dead and scores of others injured. And Hamas says that no agreement to extend the Gaza ceasefire will be reached unless its demands are met. In response to the latest restrictions imposed by the EU and the US, Russia has announced its own set of sanctions on American and European agricultural and food products. The move, which is likely to cost the European economy billions of dollars, has upped the stakes in what many have dubbed the new Cold War.
Western sanctions against Russia were being stepped up at an alarming rate over the course of the past few weeks. And after showing a high level of diplomatic patience, the Russians have now struck back. A full embargo on a wide range of food imports from the US and EU member states have been decreed by President Vladimir Putin and approved by the government. European fruits and American poultry products will be banned from Russian markets for a whole year.
Russia is introducing a full embargo on imports of beef, pork, fruit and vegetable produce, poultry, fish, cheese, milk and dairy products from the European Union, United States, Australia, Canada and Norway.
In response, the European Commission announced that it will retaliate accordingly.
The European Union regrets the announcement by the Russian Federation of measures which will target imports of food and agricultural products. The announcement is clearly politically motivated. Following a full assessment by the Commission on the Russian Federation's measures, we reserve the right to take action as appropriate.
The restrictions are considered a big blow, set to cause massive losses to exporting countries. Russia is Europe's second largest market for food and drink, and industry experts say the Russian embargo will affect 10% of EU food exports, worth about $16 billion last year alone, and may drag the continent into a crisis of glut. Among the main victims are Dutch cheese, Norwegian salmon, and Spanish fruit and vegetables. Some producers are already feeling the brunt of the sanctions after Norwegian salmon producers' share prices plummeted by 8.48% and Canadian pork producers began redirecting ships carrying the frozen meat already en route to Russia. According to the EU ambassador to Russia, the European Union might turn to the World Trade Organization to intervene. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Moscow has vowed to impose even harsher sanctions of its own. The Kremlin has warned it was weighing its options on whether to block flights between the US and Europe, a step that could also result in huge losses as far as Brussels is concerned. Moscow insists that the moves are merely in response to all the political pressure being leveled against the Russian economy and population. The tit-for-tat move will now likely send what has been termed as possibly the new Cold War to a whole new level.
Earlier, Moscow-based journalist Alina Malinovskaya said that the tit-for-tat sanctions would cost Western economies more than Russia.
The broad bans could hurt European and American agricultural and food exporters very hard. But there is no denying that the bans also have the potential of driving up already high inflation in Russia as well, and even trigger shortages of some goods. Nevertheless, Russia is at the point the largest exporter market for fruit and vegetables, from the EU, and it exports about 2 billion euro a year. And it's the second largest export market for American poultry as well. Moscow is due to announce the set of sanctions tomorrow on Friday, and we'll see a real blacklist detailing which foreign agricultural goods and which companies and food products and food producers will be banned under this order issued by President Vladimir Putin. It looks like there's some sort of provocation and some sort of pushing Russia to take additional steps in terms of sending the troops and military to Ukraine, but Russia so far tries to avoid that and tries to just improve the situation on another level. We can only admit that the West has chosen not the best, not the most effective way to put pressure on Russia and on Moscow.
Russia has granted Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor who is wanted for leaking top-secret information, a 3-year residency. Snowden's lawyer said his client has not asked for political asylum and confirmed that the residency permit took effect on August 1st.
The decision on the application has been taken, and therefore with effect from August 1st, 2014, Edward Snowden has received a 3-year residential permit. In the future, Edward himself will take a decision on whether to stay on in Russia and get Russian citizenship, or leave for the United States in time.
Thick smoke from burning tyres once again billowed over Kiev's Independence Square as demonstrators still living in the protest camp scuffled with authorities trying to clear the area. Dozens of demonstrators hurled stones and set debris alight as they halted a short-lived push by municipal workers backed by Interior Ministry troops to dismantle barricades around the entrance to the central square with bulldozers. Meanwhile, the violence in eastern Ukraine is continuing to rage. At least one person was killed and 2 others injured after a hospital in the center of the besieged rebel stronghold of Donetsk was shelled by troops loyal to Kiev.
The suffering of local residents in eastern Ukraine has apparently no limits, as pro-Kiev forces targeted civilians in a shelling crusade, ironically dubbed by the government as an anti-terrorist operation. The Regional Health Administration of Donetsk announced that a mortar shell struck the Donetsk City Hospital, killing 1 person and injuring 2 others. Artillery fire also killed 3 civilians and injured 5 others in overnight violence.
I honestly can't understand what kind of shell this could be, but my opinion is that it is a howitzer. But who knows? And it was a single shot.
When I was scared, I was lying under the dormitory building when they were bombing like that. It's such fear. You can see I found this in front of my home. I have nowhere to go. I'm from Donetsk and all my family is from Donetsk.
The latest casualties come as Ukraine's military says it is gearing up to retake the main rebel bastion in the east, after a month of moderate advances saw government forces encircle the city. And if shelling wasn't enough, an airstrike hit near the center of Donetsk for the first time Wednesday, stoking fears that the city's tree-lined streets could become the next battleground in Ukraine's almost 4-month crisis that has already killed over 1,300 people. On Wednesday, Ukrainian forces announced that 18 soldiers were killed in clashes with pro-Russian rebels, the highest daily death toll in weeks. However, civilians continue to pay the ultimate price, with more than 285,000 fleeing their homes, according to the UN refugee agency UNHCR, which warned of a massive exodus if fighting intensifies.
Now there is no way left to make a living, and we have to live here outside with kids.
Across the region, local authorities in the second largest rebel bastion of Luhansk have warned of a looming humanitarian catastrophe as water, food and fuel supplies have dried up.
NATO Secretary-General Anders Fogh Rasmussen touched down in Kiev for talks with Ukraine's leaders as tensions rise over an alleged Russian troop build-up along the country's border. The visit, at the invitation of Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, is intended to discuss an upcoming meeting on a NATO-Ukraine partnership.
Instead of de-escalating the conflict, Russia continues to destabilize Ukraine. Russia's support to the separatists continues. It has intensified in scale and sophistication.
The Lebanese army has rescued 7 internal security forces members who had been taken hostage by al-Qaeda-affiliated militant factions in the northeastern town of Arsal. This as tensions remain high in the border town, as negotiations aimed at ending the conflict and releasing the remaining 32 soldiers and ISF members continued for the 5th consecutive day between representatives from the Muslim Scholars Committee and extremist militants.
In yet another major blow to al-Qaeda-affiliated militants stationed in the northeastern Lebanese town of Arsal, 7 policemen were set free after so-called Islamic State militants withdrew from the northeastern border town of Arsal overnight, following a gun battle with the Lebanese army. Security sources said the Lebanese army's airborne carried out the operation to free the policemen, who were held at the Rafiq Hariri clinic by the terrorists who overran the town on Saturday night. Journalists who had gathered at Ain al-Shuhub checkpoint were told by the army to leave as troops were conducting operations in the highlands of Ras al-Sarj, where heavy fighting was reported. Thursday's release came after IS militants withdrew from Arsal, following a 90-minute battle with the Lebanese army that ended shortly after midnight. Local officials as well as security sources said the situation was relatively calm in Arsal after the withdrawal of the militants. It was not clear, however, whether any militants remain in Arsal. Meanwhile, a delegation from the Muslim Scholars Committee headed to Arsal on Thursday, the 3rd such visit in less than 3 days.
Militants have withdrawn from Arsal and its surrounding region. Arsal is now free of militants, and the crisis should end within hours. We are now working hard to ensure the release of the remaining soldiers and ISF members.
Negotiations over the release of the remaining 32 hostages are expected to be difficult and challenging for both sides, especially after reports emerged that Lebanese Army Chief John Ahwaji said that the captives may have been moved to a second location and even outside Lebanese territory.
Meanwhile, Syrian refugees taking shelter in the northern Lebanese town of Arsal are facing shortages of basic goods following 5 days of deadly fighting between the Lebanese army and militants in the town. A convoy was reportedly organised to transport at least 1,700 refugees from Arsal back to Syria. According to local reports, however, the refugees were refused entry back into Syria.
We are here in this very hot weather with no food or drinks. We are trapped. A fire broke out and our tents and stuff were burned, and we have no one but God.
We get reports from our refugee outreach volunteers that are there, and the situation is very fluid and very dramatic and very unsettling, and a lot of refugees have lost their homes because they were living in makeshift shelters that have now been burned, and they've sought shelter in communities, but some are still without shelter at all. And they feel very vulnerable, as do the Lebanese civilians that are also in Arsal. Now, to try to get a sense of the exact numbers, we can't be quite sure, although Lebanese officials are telling us that over 800 families have left Arsal and have now settled in other areas inside and further south in the Bekaa.
A Bahraini court has handed down jail sentences of up to 15 years to 14 Shia Bahraini activists on trial over an alleged terrorist plot against the country's monarchy. 9 of the accused were stripped of their Bahraini citizenship Authorities in the Persian Gulf monarchy have in the past revoked the citizenship of Bahraini pro-democracy activists over similar allegations. The US Secretary of State John Kerry has landed in Kabul for a surprise visit aimed at resolving Afghanistan's disputed presidential election result. During his trip, Kerry will be meeting with presidential rivals Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, as well as outgoing President Hamid Karzai. Representatives from Iran and the United States have met in Geneva for bilateral negotiations over Tehran's nuclear energy program. The latest round of discussions comes following negotiations between Iran and the P5+1 group in July, which failed to produce a comprehensive agreement.
Senior Iranian and US officials met in Geneva for talks over Tehran's disputed nuclear program as the two sides grapple for a breakthrough. According to the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Catherine Ashton, a new round of nuclear talks between Iran and the six world powers is reportedly scheduled for September 16th. Today's talks are the first round of negotiations between the two sides following talks in Vienna, during which Iran and the P5+1 group agreed to extend the July 20 deadline by 4 months in a bid to reach a comprehensive agreement. Such an accord is aimed at putting to rest claims once and for all that the Islamic Republic might use its civilian nuclear program to build an atomic bomb, claims Tehran has always categorically dismissed. The negotiating sides clinched a landmark interim deal in the Swiss city of Geneva on November 23 last year. The agreement took effect on January 20 and expired after 6 months.
A new art installation of MoMA PS1, an extension of New York's famous Museum of Modern Art, is the largest structure to ever be made out of mushroom-based bricks. Quick to produce and made of agricultural byproducts, the bricks leave virtually no environmental footprint. The tower will be up for the rest of the summer, and then the bricks broken down and turned into compost, completing a natural life cycle.
While most art is meant to last a lifetime, that's not the case with hi-fi. This towering structure is made of biodegradable bricks and will soon become plant food. Designed by architect David Benjamin, the sprouting tower is the largest construction ever built of mushroom roots and corn stalks.
You mix those two things together, and in about 5 days it grows into a solid object, and it allows us to have a new type of brick that you can make a structure out of. But also, when you take the bricks apart at the end of the summer, you can compost the whole thing.
These bricks have never been used in a large outdoor structure before, but Benjamin says they have roots in traditional architecture, where organic materials like straw, mud, and clay are used for construction. Yet hi-fi is an undoubtedly 21st century structure. 10,000 bricks create the 40-foot-high tower, which is dotted with windows that let in light. The interior stays cool in high temperatures, and it can resist 60-mile-per-hour winds. And just like its bricks, it's not meant to last forever.
Every week we've been taking some of the bricks at the top of the structure, disassembling them, putting them into compost, and turning them into fresh soil, which in turn we're using to grow new crops to complete the ecosystem of the project.
The design will be taken down by the end of summer, but Benjamin has achieved a feat, creating a modern building that leaves virtually no environmental footprint.
Here's a recap of tonight's top stories. Washington mulls military action in Iraq as Islamic State militants expand across the country, forcing thousands to flee. A wave of terrorist bombings across Iraq leaves 40 people dead and scores of others injured. And Hamas says that no agreement to extend the Gaza ceasefire will be reached unless its demands are met. Well, that's all from me and the Alicia News team. Thank you for watching and good night.